Atlantis, the Lost Continent, presented by Radio Canada International. In this program, the second in a series of 4, you will hear about the location of Atlantis, the Atlantis Lust Revived by Ignatius Donnelly, and about Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet. This series on Atlantis was created, researched, and produced by Robert Zend. In the first program, we heard from Egerton Sykes, the world's foremost living authority on Atlantis. Mr. Sykes acknowledges a great debt to Ignatius Donnelly, American congressman, author, and Atlantologist. As a congressman, said Mr. Sykes, with the whole Library of Congress to draw on within a couple of 100 yards from his office, Ignatius Donnelly was able to do his work under conditions of the greatest ease. Consequently, he started Atlantean research on its serious course of scientific investigation, which others are endeavoring to follow. Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, written in 1882, has been through more than 50 printings, almost a New Testament addition to Plato's account of the sunken continent. In the most recent edition, revised and updated by Egerton Sykes, Donnelly confidently sets out his thesis.
This book is an attempt to demonstrate several distinct and novel propositions. These are, 1, that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a huge island which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. 2, that the description of this island given by Plato is not, as has been long supposed, fable, but veritable history. 3, that Atlantis was the region where man first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. 4, that it became in the course of ages a populous and mighty nation whose overflowings from the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of South America, the Mediterranean, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian were populated by civilized nations. 5, that it was the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the Mount Olympus of the Greeks, the Asgard of the Eddas, the focus of the traditions of the ancient nations, representing a universal memory of a great land where early mankind dwelt for ages in peace and happiness. 6, that the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, and the Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis, and the acts attributed to them in mythology, a confused recollection of real historical events. 7, that the mythologies of Egypt and Peru represented the original religion of Atlantis, which was sun worship. 8, that the oldest colonies formed by the Atlanteans was probably Egypt, whose civilization was a reproduction of that of the Atlantic island. 9, the implements of the Bronze Age of Europe were derived from Atlantis. The Atlanteans were the first manufacturers of iron. 10, that the Phoenician alphabet, parent of all the European alphabets, was derived from an Atlantis alphabet, which was also conveyed from Atlantis to the Mayas of Central America. 11, that Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations, as well as the Semitic peoples, and possibly also of the Turanian races. 12, that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature, in which the whole island was submerged by the ocean with nearly all its inhabitants. 13, that a few persons escaped in ships and on rafts and carried to the nations east and west the tidings of the appalling catastrophe, which have survived to our time in the flood and deluge legends of the different nations of the old and new world. If these propositions can be proved, they will solve many problems which now perplex mankind. They will confirm in many respects the statement in the opening chapters of Genesis. They will widen the area of human history. They will explain the remarkable resemblances which exist between our ancient civilizations found upon the opposite shores of the Atlantic Ocean in the Old and New worlds, and they will aid us to rehabilitate the fathers of our civilization, our blood and our fundamental ideas, the people who lived, loved, and labored ages before the Aryans descended upon India, or the Phoenicians had settled in Syria, or the Goths had reached the shores of the Baltic. If I succeed in demonstrating the truth of the somewhat startling propositions with which I commence this chapter, it will only be by bringing to bear upon the question of Atlantis 1,000 converging lines of light and a multitude of researches made by scholars in different fields of modern thought. Further investigations and discoveries will, I trust, confirm the correctness of the conclusions at which I have arrived.
Part of Donnelly's weighty proof for the existence of Atlantis included a survey of cataclysms in man's recent history in an attempt to show the Atlantic as a tragically unstable earthquake zone. The 18th century quake in Lisbon that took 60,000 lives in 6 minutes, and the Jamaican convulsion in 1692 that submerged 1,000 acres in less than a minute. Argument still rumbles about Donnelly's conclusions to this day, but there's been a startling resonance from another major source of modern-day fascination with Atlantis, the trance readings of Edgar Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet.
Edgar Cayce's material on Atlantis,
Cayce's son, Hugh Lynn,
came with the life readings. As he began to give the psychological help for people dealing with the reincarnation, karma theories and ideas, helping people with vocational guidance, with deep-seated fears, with marriage problems and so forth. He was counseling psychologically, just as he counseled at giving people physical advice for their bodies. In 1923, in Dayton, Ohio, Edgar Cayce first mentioned the idea, the concept of reincarnation. And it came out of questions about astrology that somebody asked him. And he said this is not near as important as the urges from the past lives of this entity. For see, in the former incarnation, he was a monk. And this was the first time that the reincarnation idea was mentioned. Then members of the family and people close to my father began to get these life readings, as they began to be called, the psychological counseling. And almost immediately, within the first 5 readings, Atlantis was mentioned. I have frequently wished that he had never mentioned the subject, because it's so controversial, so impossible, so silly, that it seemed so in the beginning, that it became a very controversial point, a worldview that didn't fit in anybody's category, in anybody's basket. Plato, and all the stories about it referred to it, but there was no real evidence, real proof. It was all supposition, and it seemed to us at the times. And Donnelly's Antediluvian World and so forth had been written, and there were all these theories about it. So you could assume that Edgar Cayce was getting this out of the mind, somehow picking up all the thought and the legendary stories of Atlantis, and it was mixing it all together. But the evidence exists in a strange fashion in terms of the urges that he described as coming from incarnations in Atlantis. And the people that he talked about as having Atlantean incarnations, many of whom he never saw, reported that they indeed had that particular problem, that particular urge, that particular condition, way of thinking, way of acting, that particular weakness that he ascribed to the karmic pattern as coming from the Atlantean period. Now, if he were making it up, if he made all of this up, it was a fantastic construction, because it involved at least more than 700 of the 2,500 readings. He referred to a wide pattern going back hundreds of thousands of years in Atlantean history, coming up to a period that corresponds to Plato's destruction of Atlantis, about 9,500 BC or 10,000, somewhere in there. He referred to the records that were buried in the Mayan country and in Egypt, and are still in the Caribbean area, according to him. And he indicated that these will eventually be found. Now, this is another, whole story. And if this is actually possible and does come about, then we will have a worldview of prehistoric experiences that is utterly fantastic and quite different from the known historical periods.
Did he ever read Plato or Donnelly?
No, he'd never seen Donnelly. I got a hold of Donnelly. I studied Plato in college, but my father had no knowledge of any of this material. He'd never read any of the theosophical material. He was not a person who read a great deal. He just didn't have the kind of books around him that could possibly have influenced. If he got it from other people's writings and other people's thought, he did it telepathically, he did it clairvoyantly, he was picking it up from the scrambled picture. But out of that scrambled picture, which is if you know the Atlantean legends and stories, they'd scrambled all right. If he was getting it that way, he reconstructed it in the most amazing, beautiful, detailed pattern of prehistorical data that he says there's evidence for that can be found. And we've got to check that out, like anything else, he said.
Casey, of course, isn't alone in having received psychic information about Atlantis. Perhaps the reason his readings have caused such a stir is that they've only recently been dramatically corroborated. We'll come back to that in a minute or two. But long before Casey's crucial contribution in the 1920s, Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, and Rudolf Steiner, father of the Anthroposophical Society, had been writing of their visions of Atlantis. And in their wake have followed a score of imaginative theories. Here's James Willard, a journalist and author of The Search for Lost Worlds, with a lighter sample of what he's come across.
They start with the myth of Atlantis, which is a universal myth, because you have it in the Genesis, the flood, yes, and the Ark. See, that's the same story, really. Mm-hmm. You have it in Greek mythology. Yes, Deucalios. You have it in the Indian epics. You have it to some extent in the Icelandic sagas. Yeah. Hence, the whole myth seems to me to have a basis somewhere in history. Well, the people, the Atlanteans as they're generally called, those who are interested in this subject, and there are a lot of people still interested in it, start with the basic Platonic account. And
then they change the location of
the location changes, yes.
And they say that it was rather in the Pacific Ocean.
Yes, Pacific, Central America,
or Southern America.
Yes.
Or Africa.
Yeah, Africa, Sahara.
Or
even in Japan. Northern Europe.
Or in Russia.
Sweden. It pops up all over the place.
So actually, the Atlantis of these people could be anywhere.
Mm. And
could be any time.
Right, yes. To me, frankly, they're just a little bit eccentric, if not a little bit mad, but it's a nice sort of madness. I give a description from one of them of what these people, these Lemurians, look like. And really, it does make you laugh. I don't like laughing at these people or scoffing at them. I don't think that's fair. But this is so ridiculous, really. They say that the Lemurian, that is the man who lived on Lemuria, or Mu, because it doesn't matter, they're more or less the same, was 9 feet tall. He had an eye in the front and an eye at the back, and he could walk forwards or backwards because his feet were shaped the same way. He had sort of a toes, I suppose, on each side of his foot.
Like a T, like a letter T reversed.
Yes. They also were able to communicate by thought, which is, they never had to talk because they could communicate, and they could also copulate in the same way by thinking of this, and reproduce each other.
Telesex?
Yes. Yeah, that's a new one, but so it goes on, and
What else?
it gets sort of madder and madder. Now, where is the evidence of these 9 feet tall people who could walk forwards and backwards because their
9
feet...
feet tall people are possible, I think. But
Well,
not
yeah.
possible is to have an eye in the back and in the front,
This idea...
or have a third eye, and I don't think that...
No, wait a minute. Can I give you the exact quotation? This is a Lemurian man. It's really worth hearing. His stature was gigantic, somewhere between 12 and 15 feet. He had a long lower jaw, a strangely flattened face, eyes small but piercing and set curiously far apart so that he could see sidewise as well as in front, while the eye at the back of his head, on which part of the head no hair of course grew, enabled him to see in that direction also. In his right hand was twisted the end of a long rope, made of some sort of creeping plant, by which he held a huge and hideous reptile, somewhat resembling the plesiosaurus. The Lemurians actually domesticated these creatures and trained them to employ their strength in hunting other animals. And so it goes on, and what is he really talking about here, do you suppose? It is, as you say, it's a bit like a novelist, you see, would imagine a character. But they did not regard themselves as fiction writers. I think they would have hit us over the head if we'd have suggested that.
If Edgar Casey's readings on Atlantis are fiction, they are at least uncannily precise. Here's Casey's son, Hugh Lynn, again, talking with Robert Zend.
Now, you said that he agreed with Plato, whom he never read, regarding the time of Atlantis. What was his idea about the location of Atlantis?
He said that the Atlantis existed as an enormous continent in the Atlantic Ocean at one time. That there was a breaking up of this great continent, and it was divided up volcanic eruptions and so forth into islands, large islands. And then there was another violent eruption that was brought on by the Atlanteans themselves, misusing the power which they had developed, which is utterly fantastic, that they developed tremendous power sources and control of atomic, or he called them, use of the sun's rays through crystals. And these powerful devices actually helped set off the volcanic eruptions. And so there was only then left only one island called Posidia, and that it was in the area of what is now the Sargasso Sea. And that prior to the final destruction, the people began to move before the second destruction, that there were colonies established in northern Africa, from which I think Robert Graves had traced some legends of Atlantis. There were colonies established in the Pyrenees. There were colonies established in Egypt. There were colonies in the Mayan country, etc. And then the whole thing was wiped out and sank. And that it's been down for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, not a few years, but a great deal of time there. He would suggest that there were two great continental areas at one time. The Lemurian continent in the Pacific and the Atlantean continent, and it was the breakup of these two great continents that destroyed the mass of population that existed then, and that we're just beginning to build back to the number of bodies that are available for souls to enter the earth, and that we're not near the saturation point that existed prior to the Atlantean and the Lemurian destructions. Now, in 1923, when the first life readings were given, he began to refer to incarnations of people in Atlantis. When he actually did go to Florida and give readings on the area of Bimini, used geological descriptions of Bimini long before he was anywhere in the area, were accurate. And he did suggest that in 68, 69, he said, look for the Atlantis. Now, there were discoveries made between Bimini and the Andros Islands. There was what they now call a road and walls off of Bimini and so forth. For me, more evidential was the discovery in '69 of continental granite in several places in the West Indies. Now, it is absolutely essential that if there were a large continental area there that went down, that continental granite had to be discovered. And I understand from geologists that this is a different kind of granite from other types. We tried to drill on Bimini at one time to hit this continental granite, and we were not able, the equipment was not heavy enough to get through to any continental formation on Bimini at the time. But later, in many places, they brought up, and there are reports, geological reports, of continental granite being discovered, and the geologists said, in their opinion, a continent had gone down or was coming up here, a continental area. Now, this occurred in '69. Educase's material on Bimini itself goes back much further than anything that has been discovered so far. I think the structures that you described there may have been somewhat overemphasized, though it depends entirely on to whom you speak as to how important those are. I don't think there's been any proof yet of anything that goes back far enough back to be associated with Atlantis. There is no question in many people's minds who've investigated the area that they are looking at structures and looking at formations which were man-made and are now underwater. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they go back to the Atlantis period, to that prehistoric period of 10,000 BC, and on back to 17,000 BC, and on back to 50 and 100,000 BC.
One of the Bimini researchers, Dr. David Zink, wrote this account of an expedition in 1974.
In the following, my purpose is to clarify the sequence of various discoveries in the Bahamas, which may ultimately prove to have been the prelude to an exceedingly important discovery for mankind. The earliest events are two of Edgar Cayce's readings on Atlantis. In 1933, the first of them included the statement that a portion of the temples of Atlantis may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini, off the coast of Florida. Later in 1940, Cayce predicted the rise of the western section of Atlantis in 28 years, and Poseidea will be among the first portions of Atlantis to rise again. Expect it in 68 and 69, not so far away. The earliest discoveries in the Bimini area go back to 1956. A group of vertical marble columns was then reported in 60 feet of water. In 1958, Dr. William Bell of Marion, North Carolina, found a 6-foot column to the west of the island. It was described as protruding from a double circular gear-like base. The photographs taken in 1958 showed peculiar emanations of light from the base of the shaft. Real excitement, however, began in 1968. A year earlier, Dmitry Rebikov, inventor and underwater archaeologist, had observed from the air a large rectangle which was located north of Andros. Then, during the summer of 1968, two pilots, Robert Brush and Trigg Adams, who were members of the ARE and had been looking for the evidence predicted in the Cayce readings, observed what has since been called the Temple Site north of Andros and just off Pine Cay. It's a structure with approximate dimensions of 60 by 100 feet. The two pilots reported their discovery to Dr. J. Manson Valentine, a Miami archaeologist and anthropologist, and Rebikov. These two then went to the location and found walls 3 feet thick, which were skillfully worked in limestone, and recognized that the temple site approximates the floor plan of the Temple of the Turtles in Uxmal, Yucatan. A news story dated August 23, 1968, released Dr. Valentine's account of the temple, which was located in 6 feet of water, the top 2 feet standing above the ocean floor. Within a mile of the so-called temple, Valentine and Rebikov found 2 other submerged structures, and since that time, a total of 12 different structures has been located underwater in the Andros area. The same year, on September the 2nd, while looking for various reported sites off Bimini, Dr. Valentine and others found two so-called walls protruding about 3 feet above the sea bottom and extending for about 1,800 feet in a line approximately parallel to the shoreline. This was a short distance off Paradise Point, North Bimini Island. In Dr. Valentine's own words, he saw an extensive pavement of rectangular and polygonal flat stones of varying size and thickness, obviously shaped and accurately aligned to form a convincingly artifactual pattern. These stones had evidently lain submerged over a long span of time, for the edges of the biggest ones had become rounded off, giving the blocks the domed appearance of giant loaves of bread or pillows. Some were absolutely rectangular, sometimes approaching perfect squares.
We introduced Dr. Manson Valentine, the Yale zoologist and archaeologist, on last night's program. He has collaborated with Charles Berlitz on his two books, Mysteries of Forgotten Worlds and The Bermuda Triangle, and for the past 15 years has been exploring the Grand Bahama Banks, both from the air and underwater. Here's how he described his important Bimini discovery to our interviewer, Noel Moore.
From the air, it resembles a tremendous system. It isn't just parallel rows of stones. About analyzing all my pictures over the past 12 years, I find that there is one gigantic causeway which runs above the bottom at least 600 meters, possibly more, alternating large and small stones, and this has a curved structure near the south end, and then it straightens out, evidently goes under the bottom, and is connected with at least 3 parallel rows of very large stones, which in turn are connected with a whole mosaic of great squares as though they were the foundations of buildings or rooms or something. These, of course, have not even been looked at yet.
Whereabouts are they located?
Right out here.
Off Paradise Point?
Yes, right here, yeah. It's a very large phenomenon. It isn't anything to be disposed of.
And now that we've set our foot solidly on the question of the location of Atlantis, let's rejoin our conversation with Egerton Sykes in Brighton, England.
I would like to clear the problem of Atlantis geography. I read a lot of books, and in these books, many people of many nationalities put forward ideas according to which Atlantis was in Sweden or in North Africa or in the Soviet Union or in America itself. So I would like to know what you think about these theories, about different locations of Atlantis, and then what your own theory about it is.
You see, the Swedish theory was put up by a man called Olaf Rudbeck, writing about 1650, I think, from memory, and he postulated that Uppsala, which was his native town, where he was a professor at the university, had been the capital of Atlantis. I'm afraid there is not the slightest foundation for that claim, but it is quite possible that in the days of the Aesir and the Vanir, the legendary heroes of the Nordic race, that Uppsala was a town connected with their culture. But I cannot see that Uppsala was ever in the slightest degree related to Atlantis. I'm not sorry about that, because it would have made life much more interesting, but that is not the case. In exactly the same way, Pastor Jürgen Spannuth recently wrote a book in German, which is translated to English, called The Atlantis Mystery Solved, in which he said that Atlantis lay in the North Sea and that one of its capital cities was off Heligoland. But again, this, I'm sorry to say, is impossible. What did happen was there was a culture in the North Sea where the Dogger fishing bank now lies. And somewhere about 6000 BC, this culture was submerged together with a whole lot of towns and villages, and that is the culture of which Pastor Spannuth is writing. Another similar work is the Linde book, which was discovered, written in Old Frisian. It was discovered in Holland about a century ago. And that postulated a civilization of about the time they thought of Atlantis, living further south in the North Sea. Again, yes, there was a civilization there. Yes, it was contemporary with that of Spannuth, but it was not part of Atlantis. It was far too far away. Again, I very much regret it because it was an interesting culture, but it doesn't happen to be the one for which we're looking. Now, as to Atlantis being in North Africa, well, quite a lot of people, including the Gatterfossa brothers, who were really experts on the whole question, thought that North Africa had been Atlantis, particularly the region of the Atlas Mountains. I fear that they were wrong, and that most of their ideas were more of a patriotic nature, particularly those inspired by the book by Pierre Benoit called L'Atlantide, which came out in 1919 in Paris, which talked of a queen of Atlantis living in the Sahara Desert in North Africa. I am sorry, but North Africa was not Atlantis. I should much like it to have been it, because it would have saved a lot of trouble, but this is not the case. It may have been affected by it, it was probably influenced by it, and there may even have been Atlantean colonies along the coast, but it was not Atlantis itself. Now, another idea is that Atlantis lay in the Caucasus. This was put up about 60 years ago by a man called Fessenden, an American engineer who had been resident for many years in the Caucasus. He came to the conclusion that not only Atlantis, but the fount of our civilization sprang from the Caucasus. Well, as far as the fount of our civilization is concerned, there is a lot in it, because most of the artificer clans, like the Cabiri, the Corybantes, the Curites, the Dactyls, the Sintians, the Telchines, and others, started off from the Caucasian coast, most of them from Colchis. But that is not sufficient to give any proof that the Caucasus were Atlantis.
From time to time, stories have filtered down about a possible connection between Spain and Atlantis. We asked Edgerton Sykes about that.
A writer in Spain called Verdaguer wrote a manuscript in Catalan between the years 1877 and 1878 called Atlantida, dealing with the relationship between the adventures of Hercules and his people, the Heraclidae, when they occupied Spain, and how they fitted in with his concept of Atlantis. He was the man who inspired Miguel de Falla, the famous opera composer, to compose the opera Atlantida, which was put on at La Scala Milan a few years ago, and has since been performed in various Latin American countries, but not, as far as I know, in Northern Europe. The basic assumption was that Hercules and his labors were directly tied up with the story of Atlantis. I cannot quite accept this, because I think that Hercules and the Heraclidae occupied Spain at a date several thousand years after the disappearance of Atlantis. But there is not the slightest doubt that much of the early culture told of in the stories of the Heraclidae, or even written up by the English authoress E.M. Wishaw in her Atlantis in Andalusia, published before the First War, they all show that there was a distinct connection between Spain and Atlantis. I suppose this was because they were contiguous. It was quite easy to get from one place to the other. And I have a very strong feeling that such of the Atlantean culture which really implanted itself in Europe may have done so in the south of Spain. In 1973 and 4, there were attempts to find traces of Atlantis off the coast of Spain near Cadiz. Cities and walls were found, but to my mind, while they may easily have been contemporary with Atlantis, or probably slightly later, they were on the European continental shelf, which was separated from Atlantis by a gulf several hundred miles wide and 5 or 6 miles deep. And at no time within the last 100,000 years can Atlantis have been joined to Spain, or for that matter, to the African coast. When we talk about the relationship of Atlantis with Africa, we of course are mainly working on the assumption that refugees from Atlantis eventually reached Egypt and set up the first Egyptian dynasty and brought culture to Egypt. That is quite possible, but the distance from the Atlantic coast to the Nile overland is very long, and it can only have been possible to make it at a time when the climate of the Sahara was different to what it is now. We know that at one period the Sahara supported fleets of elephants, of giraffes, of deer, and all kinds of small animals, and was very, very fertile. Then, for some unknown reason, the climate changed, and it became the desert that it now is. Any migration on a large scale across the Sahara must have been done about the time of the climatic change, certainly not much later. That is something which we shall have to fit in, because as far as we know, the first Egyptians turned up in the Nile Valley about 5000 BC, which is 5,000 years later than the loss of Atlantis. Possibly they may have settled in western parts of northern Africa that amount of time. We don't know, and nobody has yet had the opportunity of exploring all the possibilities. Several of my French friends have gone into it very extensively, but the difficulties on making explorations across the Sahara are extreme. For example, Count Byron de Prorok, a Polish nobleman with an American wife, made several journeys across the Sahara in the 1920s and managed in the process to discover the grave of one of the last descendants of what he considered to be the Atlantean royal family Queen Antenea. And I actually saw her skeleton myself about 50 years ago. Unfortunately, the skeleton was subsequently taken to a museum in North Africa and has since disappeared and has not been seen by anybody for about 25 years. Now deal with the most famous hypothesis of all. That is the assumption that the island of Santorin in the eastern Mediterranean was Atlantis. This has been put forward by Professor Garbanopoulos, a very well-known authority on seismology, who is a Greek professor, and a number of his friends. To my mind, it is untenable. I may say that it was first ventilated in the year, I think, 1912, when a man called Frost wrote to the London Times suggesting that Crete might have been the Atlantis, on the basis of which Plato wrote.
And seductive the Santorini thesis is, too. Here's John V. Luce, a classics professor and author of The End of Atlantis, in his rooms at Trinity College, Dublin.
I've been an Irishman born and bred, and there have always been traditions in the west of Ireland, particularly, of land to the west of the lost continent, and I was always interested in the legend of Atlantis as a result, but I'd never gone into it in a scholarly way, you might say, till, I suppose, the early 1960s, when I began to be a lecturer on Hellenic cruises, and often we have to lecture on topics which we're not experts in. It fell to my lot to do Minoan and Crete on one cruise, so I read all the standard works on Minoan and Crete, and in the course of this reading I came on a reference to the possibility that the lost civilization of Atlantis was really the lost civilization of Minoan and Crete, and something sort of clicked in my mind at that stage, and I thought, that's a very interesting hypothesis, I'll work a bit more at that. So I worked it up in the form of a lecture, and almost simultaneously there were some exciting archaeological discoveries on the island of Santorini, or Thera in the Aegean, which seemed to mesh in very well with the line I was working on. So on this island you have a buried city, rather like Pompeii Herculaneum, which was filled in with ash from the Santorini volcano, and which has preserved the houses to an extraordinary degree. They're still standing up to 4 stories in some places. All the beautiful fresco decorations are still on the walls, the storerooms crowded with beautiful vases, and you get the impression that life just finished the other day in these places. Extraordinary close immediate sense of contact with the past.
What time would that have been?
Well, the date is disputed, but not within wide limits, because our knowledge of the pottery for that period is extensive, and there are many synchronisms with Egypt which gives us an absolute dating. But the experts are sort of arguing as between, say, 1500 BC and 1450 BC. It's within the limits of about 50 years.
How does that jibe with other theories of when Atlantis must have existed?
Well, of course, it does agree with the primary dating in this case, which comes from Plato's treatment of the legend, and he is quite explicit that the events which he describes occurred 9,000 years before his own day. Well, that would put them back to about 10,000 BC, that sort of date.
Plato's Atlantis was 10,000.
Plato's Atlantis, yes, 10 to 9,000 BC. So it doesn't agree well with that, and one has to argue as to whether the figure has been perhaps garbled in the course of transmission or something of the sort. But I have my own explanation for the 9,000 figure. It relates to Plato's view of Egyptian chronology, which he was not well informed about. He, like a modern tourist, went to ancient Egypt and was astonished by that civilization, and the priests who talked to him managed to impress him with their great antiquity and trotted out evidence which he was inclined to accept, that Egypt went back for 10,000 years, which of course totally incorrect, we know that now. And I think they put him off about the dating, but his date of 9,000 years before his time is just meant to indicate something in the remote past.
There are some even who suggest Plato was careless enough to have added a 0 to his reckoning, that he meant to record Atlantis' destruction in 900 and not 9000 B.C. But Edgerton Sykes won't have any of it.
I find myself somewhat embarrassed by the peculiar nature of the accusations which are made against Plato in connection with his works on Atlantis. Plato was perhaps the most important philosophical writer of the great Greek era of philosophy. He was a man of unquestioned integrity and a man who, while being slightly involved in politics, as all Greeks of his status had to be, he was certainly not, to my mind, the type of person who would have mutilated or destroyed the validity of his philosophical theories simply to please the Greek government of the day. If one looks back at the records of the various philosophers who suffered death and imprisonment rather than change their opinions in that period, I fail to see the slightest reason why it should have been assumed that Plato would have been any less capable of standing up for himself than the others. And that was the standard on which Greek philosophy of the period was based. Next thing is this. Plato was one of the wisest men of his time, and there was no reason at all to suppose that he would make the stupid mistake of misinterpreting the Egyptian calendar, particularly when it is borne in mind that he himself visited Egypt and spent a period of several months there. Well, during that time he had as good an opportunity as anybody else of becoming acquainted with the vagaries of the Egyptian calendrical system, and he would certainly not have made mistaken references to it in his writings when he came back afterwards. These judgments on a man who is now dead and was one of the greatest men of his period are, in the main, passed by people who are confident of the fact that the person they attack cannot possibly hit back, and also that there are very few people who are inclined to go and stand up and defend him as I'm trying to do now.
Plato's myths are an appeal to the imagination as much as to the reason, and they have a sort of artistic quality of vivid presentation. They're like a play, really, which symbolizes things which convey more than can be put in logical terms. All this is very important and should be brought out in an all-round discussion.
All right. Isn't there some pretty convincing evidence for the cataclysmic destruction of the civilization in Crete?
Yes, but unfortunately, there is not one single facet of the civilization of Crete which in the slightest degree resembles the civilization mentioned by Plato in his writings on Atlantis. In addition to that, Santorin blew up and made the explosion which probably caused the plagues of Egypt in BC 1376. That has been decisively dated because an observation of a solar eclipse in that year, which was being made at Ugarit on the Syrian coast, about 40 miles away, was stopped in the middle by the eruption, which burnt the paper on which the observation was being made and destroyed the observatory. Nothing that Gallinopoulos and his friends have been able to put up fits in with anything else as far as Atlantis is concerned. As far as a natural disaster, yes. But the Santorin disaster was not sufficiently important to be noticed in Spain, anywhere in Central Europe, or in northwestern Africa. And had it been of the dimensions assumed necessary to destroy the culture of Atlantis, it would have been remarked elsewhere. The entire Santorin setup has received an immense amount of publicity in the last few years, which I rather think is disproportionate to its value. Because recently the Greek government invited a shipload of scientists and archaeologists to take an excursion round the Greek Isles and to see Santorini. And several films were produced on it, most of which I have seen. And in general, they were interesting as travel films, but they carried no particular conviction to anybody who had studied the subject in the slightest.
Legend of Lost Atlantis, just a myth, explorer says. Athens, UPI. French oceanographer Jacques-Yves Cousteau yesterday debunked the legend of Atlantis after completing 13 months of underwater archaeological exploration in the Aegean Sea. Cousteau told a news conference aboard his research ship Calypso, "We find the Atlantis myth interesting from a human standpoint, but I believe the story was a model for a future society, not a historic fact. The only text of the legend is in Plato, who was a philosopher and theoretician of the ideal society," he said. "It's amazing how the story has lasted." Archaeologists believe the story of Atlantis, a civilization supposedly submerged in a tidal wave after a natural disaster, may refer to a volcanic exploration on the Greek island of Santorini, Tyra, around 1450 BC, which coincided with the collapse of the Minoan civilization on Crete. "There's nothing to be found off Santorini ever," Cousteau said. "Our divers found everything covered in a thick layer of lava." Cousteau's team made 1,500 dives and spent more than 300 hours underwater during a $1.8 million project to survey and film undersea antiquities in the Aegean.
I tend to adopt the academic approach perhaps defensively, because anyone who devotes himself to the Atlantis problem tends to be written off as a crank, you see, and one could lose one's academic reputation for objectivity and for reasonableness quite easily unless you guard yourself closely. So I've always had to be a bit careful about indulging in speculation. There's nothing really wrong in indulging in speculation, but certain people would think that it wasn't a fit subject for academic study at all, and I've got to show that it is, really.
Do you dream about Atlantis?
No, I can't say that I've ever dreamt about Atlantis. It has always appealed to me in my waking moments, but I'm not conscious about dreaming about it.
Well, it seems that the question of Atlantis' geographical location can only itself be laid to a watery rest, buffeted by the tides of conjecture. But we leave the last word to Egerton Sykes.
I feel myself that all the manifestations of Atlantis, which people talk about, are only really subsidiary to the main continent itself lying in the Atlantic. And any other answer, my mind, is a negation of the real facts. Atlantis is exactly where Plato said it was, outside the Pillars of Hercules. And it represents a civilization, a culture, earlier than our own, but none the worse for that, and which formed of itself a bridge between Africa and Europe on the one side and America on the other. A concept first put forward by Ignatius Donnelly many years ago.
So the end of this program's exploring, as with so much that concerns Atlantis, finds us right where we started. Along the way, you heard Egerton Sykes, John B. Luce, Dr. Manson Valentine, Hugh Lynn Casey, and James Welland. In our next program, we'll take a look at the other network, New Evidence for an Ancient Civilization. This series was created and produced by Robert Zend, with co-production and direction by Tim Wilson and Len Shear for Radio Canada International.